They said it with that tone parents use when they've already decided you're the problem. Maya, you're embarrassing us again. Can't you just act normal for once? The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire. I didn't start, but somehow, I was always the one holding the matches. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I looked around the country club dining room, at the perfectly pressed tablecloths, and the crystal glasses catching afternoon light, at my mother's tight smile, and my father's disappointed shake of his head. Everyone was staring. Everyone was waiting for my response. I gave them exactly what they expected. I smiled, nodded, and excused myself to the bathroom where I could breathe without an audience. My name is Maya Rodriguez, and if you think this is just about another family dinner gone wrong, you're about to discover what happens when the quiet daughter they've been underestimating for years turns out to be someone they never saw coming. That Sunday afternoon at the Riverside Country Club was supposed to be a celebration. My cousin Rachel had just gotten engaged to some investment banker, whose biggest accomplishment seemed to be his ability to drop brand names into casual conversation. The whole extended family had gathered, 3 generations of Rodriguezes and Garcias, all dressed in their Sunday best and ready to toast the happy couple. I should have known it would turn into another opportunity for my parents to showcase everything they thought was wrong with me. It started innocently enough. Rachel was showing off her ring, a massive diamond that caught the light from every angle, and everyone was oohing and ahhing appropriately. The conversation naturally drifted to relationships, to marriage, to the future. My Aunt Carmen, never one to miss an opportunity for drama, looked directly at me and asked the question I'd been dreading all afternoon. So Maya, when are you going to settle down? You're 28 now, aren't you? Most girls your age are at least engaged by now. I felt the familiar tightness in my chest, the way my shoulders automatically tensed whenever family gatherings turned into interrogations about my life choices. I had learned long ago that explaining myself only made things worse, so I gave my standard diplomatic response. I'm focused on my career right now, Tia Carmen. The right person will come along when the time is right. My mother, Elena, let out one of those sighs that could power a small wind turbine. Maya's always been too picky, she announced to the table, as if I wasn't sitting right there. She thinks she's too good for the nice boys we introduce her to. Remember Roberto? The doctor's son? She went on one date with him and never called him back. He spent 2 hours explaining why women shouldn't work in dangerous professions, I said quietly, stirring my iced tea with more focus than it required. He said it wasn't natural. See what I mean? My mother threw her hands up dramatically, always with the attitude. Roberto was being protective. That's what good men do. She turned to address the table like she was delivering a sermon. I don't know where we went wrong with this one. Her sister Isabel is married with 2 beautiful children, settled down like a proper woman should be. But Maya, she's got these ideas about independence and careers that don't make sense. My father Luis nodded sagely from behind his beer. She's been difficult since she was little. Remember when she wanted to join the wrestling team in high school? Wrestling! Can you imagine? We had to put our foot down. It's not feminine. Not appropriate for a young lady. The words stung because they were nothing new. This was the soundtrack of my childhood, the constant reminder that I didn't fit into the mold they'd created for me. Too ambitious. Too stubborn. Too interested in things that didn't align with their vision of what their daughter should want. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. I'd heard variations of this conversation at every family gathering since I turned 18, and I was tired of defending myself to people who had no interest in understanding me. Uncle Miguel, Rachel's father, decided to join the pile-on. What exactly do you do for work anyway, Maya? Something with computers, right? One of those tech jobs where you work from home all day? That's not really a career, is it? It's more like a hobby that pays. I felt my jaw clench. I work in cybersecurity, I said evenly, for the federal government. Oh, government work, my mother said dismissively. Well, that explains the attitude. All those government workers think they're so important, but really they're just pushing papers around all day. No wonder you can't find a husband. Men don't want to deal with women who think they know everything. That's when Rachel's fiancé, Brandon, decided to contribute his wisdom to the conversation. You know, Maya, maybe your parents have a point. I mean, my buddy works in IT for some government contractor, and he says it's mostly just babysitting computers and filling out forms. Nothing too challenging. Maybe if you found something more traditional? Something that would give you time to focus on building a real relationship? The condescension in his voice was thick enough to cut with a knife. Here was a man who'd known me for exactly 3 hours, telling me that my career choice was preventing me from finding love, while my entire family nodded along like he was dispensing profound wisdom. I looked around the table at these people who were supposed to love and support me, and all I saw were faces that had already written me off as a disappointment. Maya's always been dramatic about these things, my father added, shaking his head. She gets these ideas in her head about being some kind of important professional, but at the end of the day, what matters is family. What matters is finding a good man and building a life together. All this career nonsense is just an excuse to avoid growing up and taking responsibility. My Aunt Carmen leaned forward conspiratorially. You know what I think? I think Maya watches too much television. All these crime shows and action movies, they give girls unrealistic ideas about what women can do. In the real world, sweetheart, men handle the dangerous stuff. Women take care of the home and children. That's how it's always been. That's how it should be. I could feel my hands trembling slightly as I reached for my water glass. Not from anger, exactly, though that was certainly part of it. More from the familiar feeling of being completely invisible to the people who claimed to know me best. They were talking about me like I was a problem to be solved, a disappointment to be managed, rather than a person with my own thoughts and feelings and accomplishments. She's embarrassing us, my mother said, and there it was, the words that would replay in my mind for weeks afterward. All our friends have daughters who are married, who have given them grandchildren, who understand what it means to be a woman. And we have Maya, sitting here arguing about computers and government jobs like any of that matters in the real world. The entire table fell silent for a moment, the weight of her words settling over the conversation like a blanket. I felt every eye on me, waiting to see how I would respond to being called an embarrassment by my own mother in front of the entire extended family. Part of me wanted to stand up and walk away, to remove myself from this toxic conversation and preserve what was left of my dignity. But another part of me, the part that had been biting its tongue for years, wanted to finally tell them exactly what I thought of their narrow-minded assumptions. Instead, I did what I always did. I smiled politely and excused myself to the bathroom, where I could collect my thoughts and figure out how to get through the rest of this afternoon without completely losing my composure. As I walked away from the table, I heard my mother's voice behind me, explaining to anyone who would listen that I'd always been sensitive, always been prone to overreacting when people tried to give me helpful advice. In the bathroom mirror, I stared at my reflection and tried to recognize the person looking back at me. Professionally styled dark hair, understated makeup, a conservative dress chosen specifically to avoid giving my family anything else to criticize. I looked exactly like what I was, a woman trying desperately to blend in, to avoid conflict, to keep the peace at any cost. But underneath that carefully constructed exterior was someone they'd never bothered to get to know. Someone who had been working 16-hour days for the past 6 months on a case that would make headlines if the public knew about it. Someone who had spent the last 3 years building a reputation within the federal law enforcement community as one of the most skilled digital forensic specialists on the East Coast. Someone who had sacrificed relationships, social opportunities, and family time to pursue excellence in a field that demanded everything and gave back very little, except the satisfaction of knowing that the work mattered. They saw a stubborn, unmarried woman approaching 30 with nothing to show for her life except a government job they didn't understand and couldn't respect. What they didn't see was Agent Maya Rodriguez, the woman who had spent the last 18 months infiltrating one of the most sophisticated cybercriminal networks in North America, gathering evidence that would eventually lead to dozens of arrests and potentially save thousands of people from financial ruin. But as I stood in that bathroom, listening to the muffled sounds of my family's laughter through the wall, none of that seemed to matter. All that mattered was the fact that the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally had just made it clear that they found my very existence embarrassing, that the daughter they'd raised, the woman I'd become, was somehow a reflection of their failure as parents. I took a deep breath, checked my appearance one more time, and walked back to the table where the conversation had already moved on to other topics. Nobody acknowledged my return. Nobody asked if I was okay. I sat quietly through the rest of the meal, contributing only when directly asked a question, and spent the remainder of the afternoon counting the minutes until I could politely escape. The drive home to my apartment in downtown Washington was a blur of highway exits and traffic lights, my mind replaying the conversation over and over again. By the time I pulled into my parking garage, I had convinced myself that maybe they were right. Maybe I was being stubborn and unrealistic. Maybe I was using my career as an excuse to avoid the kind of traditional life they wanted for me. It wasn't until I was sitting in my kitchen, still wearing that conservative dress and looking at the commendation letter that had arrived in the mail that morning, that I remembered who I actually was. The letter was from the director of the FBI, formally recognizing my contribution to a joint task force operation that had resulted in the largest cybercrime bust in the agency's history. It was the kind of recognition that most agents spend their entire careers hoping to receive, and it was sitting on my kitchen counter next to a stack of unpaid bills and takeout menus. I had been so focused on my family's disappointment, so caught up in their narrow definition of success and worthiness, that I had almost forgotten the call I'd received on Friday afternoon. The call that would change everything but that I couldn't tell anyone about until the operation was complete. The call that had made me the youngest woman ever selected to lead a multi-agency cybercrime task force, reporting directly to the assistant director of the FBI's Criminal Investigative Division. As I sat in my quiet apartment that evening, still processing the afternoon's humiliation, I realized that my family's judgment stung so much precisely because part of me had always craved their approval. Despite years of pursuing my own path, despite building a career that challenged and fulfilled me in ways they couldn't understand, I still wanted them to be proud of me. I still wanted them to see me as something other than a disappointment. But that night, surrounded by case files and technical manuals and evidence of a life they'd never bothered to learn about, I made a decision that would define everything that came next. I stopped trying to earn their approval and started focusing on the work that actually mattered. Because in less than 2 weeks, I would be standing in front of cameras and microphones, explaining to the world how my team had dismantled a criminal enterprise that had stolen over $200 million from American citizens. And my parents, who had spent the afternoon explaining to anyone who would listen why I was such an embarrassment to the family name, were about to discover that the daughter they'd written off as a disappointment had been protecting their country while they worried about wedding plans and grandchildren. The irony wasn't lost on me. While they criticized my career choices and questioned my priorities, I had been working cases that would eventually make the evening news. While they suggested that I was avoiding responsibility and refusing to grow up, I was carrying security clearances that most people didn't even know existed. While they worried about my inability to find a suitable husband, I was building professional relationships with some of the most respected law enforcement officials in the country. But none of that knowledge made the afternoon's conversation hurt any less. Family dynamics have a way of reducing even the most accomplished adults back to the insecure children they used to be. And sitting at that country club table, I had felt every bit as small and inadequate as they believed me to be. The difference was that this time, I knew it wasn't true. This time, I had evidence that contradicted their assessment of my worth and my potential. As I finally changed out of that conservative dress and into comfortable clothes, I thought about all the family gatherings over the years, all the conversations where I'd been made to feel like I was somehow failing at life because I didn't want the same things they wanted for me. I thought about the boyfriends I'd introduced to them who had been deemed unsuitable for various reasons, usually because they supported my career ambitions or didn't express immediate interest in starting a family. I thought about the achievements I'd stopped sharing with them because the response was always the same: polite indifference followed by suggestions that I was prioritizing the wrong things. When I'd graduated at the top of my class from the FBI Academy, my mother had asked why I couldn't have chosen a safer career, maybe something in teaching or nursing. When I'd received my first commendation for excellence in digital forensics, my father had wondered aloud why I spent so much time focused on work, instead of finding a nice young man to settle down with. Over the years, I had learned to keep my professional life separate from my family relationships. It was easier than constantly defending choices they would never understand or support. But that separation had created a strange double life, where the people who knew me best actually knew me least. My family saw only the version of Maya, who showed up to holiday dinners and birthday parties. The version who smiled politely and changed the subject when conversations turned to topics that might reveal too much about who I really was. The Maya they didn't know was the one who had spent the last 6 months working 18-hour days, collaborating with agents from multiple agencies, building cases that required precision and patience and expertise they couldn't even comprehend. The Maya they didn't know had been selected for leadership roles based on merit and performance, not because she was someone's daughter or wife. The Maya they didn't know had earned respect in one of the most challenging and competitive fields in federal law enforcement. But as I prepared for bed that night, I realized that their ignorance about my professional life was as much my fault as theirs. I had chosen to protect myself from their criticism by keeping them at arm's length, sharing only the parts of my life that wouldn't trigger their disapproval. In doing so, I had allowed them to maintain their illusions about who I was and what I was capable of achieving. That was about to change. Because in less than 2 weeks, the case I'd been working on would go public, and with it would come a level of visibility that I couldn't control or contain. The same parents who had spent the afternoon explaining why I was such a disappointment were about to see their daughter's face on the evening news, standing next to the director of the FBI as he announced the results of the largest cybercrime investigation in the agency's history. I fell asleep that night thinking about the moment when they would finally understand that the career they'd dismissed as unimportant had actually been preparing me for something extraordinary. The moment when they would realize that while they were worrying about my marital status and questioning my priorities, I had been building a life that mattered in ways they'd never considered. The next morning brought new developments in the case, new evidence to analyze, new strategies to implement. I threw myself into the work with even more intensity than usual, partly because the timeline was accelerating, and partly because I needed something to occupy my mind other than replaying the previous day's conversation. There's something uniquely painful about being misunderstood by the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally, and I was still processing the emotional aftermath of that afternoon at the country club. But work had always been my sanctuary, the place where my value was measured by results rather than conformity to someone else's expectations. In the sterile offices of the FBI field headquarters, surrounded by colleagues who respected my expertise and judgment, I could forget about family dynamics and focus on what I did best: solving complex problems and catching criminals who thought they were smarter than law enforcement. The case that was about to make me famous within the law enforcement community had started 18 months earlier with a single suspicious transaction flagged by a bank's fraud detection system. What began as a routine investigation into credit card fraud had evolved into something much larger and more complex, eventually revealing a sophisticated network of cybercriminals operating across state and international lines. My role had started small, providing technical analysis and digital forensic support to the primary investigators. But as the scope of the operation became clear, my responsibilities had expanded rapidly. I was the agent who had identified the patterns that connected seemingly unrelated crimes. I was the one who had developed the techniques for tracing cryptocurrency transactions that the criminals thought were untraceable. I was the one who had built the digital profiles that allowed us to identify the key players in the network. By the time the task force was formally established, I had become indispensable to the operation. When the assistant director needed someone to coordinate the technical aspects of the investigation, my name was the first one suggested. When they needed someone who could communicate complex technical concepts to prosecutors and judges, I was the obvious choice. When they needed someone who could work effectively with international law enforcement agencies, my track record spoke for itself. The promotion to agent in charge had been both a recognition of the work I'd already done and a vote of confidence in my ability to see the operation through to completion. At 28, I was the youngest woman ever selected for that level of responsibility in a major federal investigation. But my age had become irrelevant in the face of the results I'd delivered, none of which my family knew or would have understood if I'd tried to explain it to them. To them, I was still the stubborn daughter who had refused to follow the traditional path they'd mapped out for her. To them, my work was still just a government job that kept me too busy to focus on the things that really mattered, like finding a husband and starting a family. As I worked through that Monday morning, analyzing the latest evidence and coordinating with agents in 3 different field offices, I found myself thinking about the conversation I would eventually have with my parents. Not the one where I defended my life choices or tried to explain why their vision for my future didn't align with my own goals, but the one where I simply presented them with facts they couldn't dismiss or minimize. Because in less than 2 weeks, the FBI director himself would be standing at a podium, announcing the successful conclusion of an operation that had taken down one of the most sophisticated cybercriminal networks ever identified. He would be thanking the agents whose dedication and expertise had made the arrests possible. He would be specifically acknowledging the leadership of Agent Maya Rodriguez, the task force commander whose innovative approaches and tireless work had been instrumental in the investigation's success. And my parents, who had spent the previous afternoon explaining to the entire extended family why I was such an embarrassment, would be watching it all unfold on the evening news. The call came at 6:15 on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after the country club incident. I was already dressed, and halfway through my first cup of coffee when my secure phone rang, with the tone that meant priority communication from headquarters. Assistant Director Patricia Williams never called this early unless something significant was happening, and her voice carried that particular edge that meant the timeline for everything was about to accelerate. Rodriguez, we need you in the briefing room by 7:30. The Attorney General's office has moved up the timeline. We're executing warrants across 6 states starting Thursday morning. Her words were crisp, professional, but I could hear the underlying current of excitement that came with knowing we were finally moving from investigation to action. I set down my coffee cup and reached for the secure laptop that never left my apartment, already mentally shifting into the focused mindset that major operations required. What changed? I asked, pulling up the encrypted files that contained our target list and operational plans. Our friends in Prague got impatient. They're accelerating their own timeline, which means if we don't move now, we lose our opportunity to coordinate simultaneous arrests. The international component of this operation falls apart if we can't maintain synchronization with our European counterparts. The European connection was the element that had transformed this from a significant domestic cybercrime case into something with genuine international implications. The network we'd been tracking had tentacles reaching into 14 countries, with command and control servers distributed across jurisdictions that normally didn't cooperate well with each other. Getting everyone to agree on coordinated timing had been a diplomatic achievement, almost as complex as the technical investigation itself. I'll need to brief the team leads by 9, I said, already calculating the logistics in my head. And we'll have to advance the media preparation timeline as well. If we're executing on Thursday, the press conference has to be Friday to stay ahead of the inevitable leaks. That's why you're in charge of this task force, Rodriguez. You think 3 steps ahead. There was something in the assistant director's voice that suggested approval, maybe even pride, and it reminded me of how different this world was from the one I'd left behind at that country club dining table. Here, thinking ahead wasn't seen as being difficult or stubborn. Here, it was recognized as leadership. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of secure communications, encrypted file transfers, and coordination calls with field offices from Seattle to Miami. By 9 o'clock, I was standing in front of a conference room full of senior agents, federal prosecutors, and technical specialists, walking them through the final operational plan for what we had codenamed Operation Digital Fortress. Ladies and gentlemen, we are 48 hours away from dismantling the largest cybercriminal enterprise in North American history. I began, looking out at faces that represented years of collective experience in federal law enforcement. This network has stolen over $200 million from American citizens, compromised the personal information of nearly 500,000 people, and operated with impunity for almost 3 years. That ends Thursday morning. The room was completely silent as I walked them through the intelligence we'd gathered, the evidence we'd compiled, and the coordinated strategy that would allow us to arrest 37 suspects across 6 time zones simultaneously. These were people who had seen major operations before, agents who had worked cases that made headlines and changed lives, but even they seemed impressed by the scope and complexity of what we had built. Special Agent Marcus Thompson, a 20-year veteran who had been skeptical of my appointment to lead the task force, raised his hand during the technical briefing. Agent Rodriguez, Can you walk us through the cryptocurrency tracking methodology one more time? Some of the prosecutors are going to need to understand this well enough to explain it to a jury. It was a fair question, and one that demonstrated how much the landscape of federal law enforcement had evolved in recent years. Traditional investigative techniques that had worked for decades were often inadequate when dealing with crimes that existed primarily in digital spaces, conducted by criminals who understood technology better than most of the agents tasked with catching them. I spent the next 20 minutes explaining how we had developed new techniques for tracing transactions through multiple blockchain networks, how we had identified patterns that allowed us to connect seemingly anonymous cryptocurrency wallets to real-world identities, and how we had worked with international partners to track money as it moved through digital exchanges in countries with varying levels of cooperation with American law enforcement. The beauty of this approach, I concluded, is that the criminals thought they were hiding behind technology that made them invisible. What they didn't realize is that digital transactions leave traces that are actually more permanent and more detailed than traditional financial records. Every transaction is recorded forever, and once you know how to read the blockchain, following the money becomes a matter of patience and processing power. Agent Thompson nodded slowly, making notes on his legal pad. And you developed this methodology specifically for this case? The foundational techniques existed, but we had to adapt and refine them significantly to deal with the level of sophistication this network was operating at. They were using privacy coins, tumbling services, and cross-chain swaps in combinations that hadn't been seen before. We essentially had to invent new approaches to keep up with their innovation. After the briefing, I found myself in the quiet of my office, surrounded by case files and technical manuals, trying to process the magnitude of what was about to happen. In less than 48 hours, the work that had consumed my life for the past 18 months would finally reach its conclusion. The criminals we had been tracking would be in custody, their network dismantled, and their victims would finally have some measure of justice. But beyond the professional satisfaction of completing a complex investigation, I was beginning to understand that this case would fundamentally change my career trajectory. The success of Operation Digital Fortress would open doors that had previously been closed, create opportunities that hadn't existed before, and establish a reputation that would define my professional identity for years to come. My secure phone buzzed with a text message from Assistant Director Williams. Director Morrison wants to personally brief you on the media strategy tomorrow. His office, 10 a.m. This is going to be bigger than we initially anticipated. Director Morrison was the FBI director himself, the person who reported directly to the Attorney General and served as the public face of the Bureau during major announcements. The fact that he wanted to personally brief me on media strategy meant that Operation Digital Fortress was being viewed at the highest levels as something potentially career-defining, not just for me, but for the Bureau itself. I leaned back in my chair and allowed myself a moment to consider the irony of the situation. Less than a week earlier, I had been sitting at a country club table while my mother explained to the extended family why my career choices were so disappointing. She had specifically criticized my government job as unimportant paper-pushing that prevented me from focusing on what really mattered in life. In 48 hours, I would be standing next to the director of the FBI as he announced the successful conclusion of one of the most significant cybercrime investigations in American history. The same parents who had found my career so embarrassing would be watching their daughter receive recognition at the highest levels of federal law enforcement. The afternoon brought a steady stream of final preparations, last-minute coordination calls, and technical briefings that would ensure every aspect of the operation proceeded smoothly. I found myself moving through the familiar rhythms of pre-operational planning, the careful attention to detail that meant the difference between success and failure in complex law enforcement actions. Agent Sarah Chen, my deputy task force commander and one of the most skilled digital forensics specialists I'd ever worked with, knocked on my office door around 4 o'clock. "Maya, do you have a minute? There's something I wanted to discuss before we execute on Thursday." Sarah and I had developed a strong working relationship over the course of the investigation, built on mutual respect and complementary skill sets. She was more technical than I was, with a background in computer science that made her invaluable when dealing with the most sophisticated aspects of the criminal's operations. I was more strategic, better at seeing the big picture and coordinating the various elements that made complex investigations successful. "What's on your mind?" I asked, gesturing for her to take a seat across from my desk. "I've been thinking about the media attention this is going to generate, and I wanted to make sure you're prepared for how different things are going to be after Friday's press conference. This isn't just going to be a story in the law enforcement trade publications. This is going to be national news, probably international coverage. Your name is going to be associated with this case for the rest of your career. She was right, of course. I had been so focused on the operational aspects of the investigation that I hadn't fully considered the personal implications of the media attention that would follow. Federal agents usually worked in relative anonymity, their successes measured internally rather than in public forums. But cases of this magnitude had a way of creating public profiles that extended far beyond the law enforcement community. "Are you concerned about something specific?" I asked, curious about what had prompted her to bring this up. Not concerned, exactly, more like, I want to make sure you understand what an opportunity this represents. There are agents with 20-year careers who never get the kind of recognition you're about to receive. This could open doors that normally stay closed, create opportunities that don't usually exist for someone at your level. Sarah was being diplomatic, but I understood what she was really saying. Success at this level, at this age, with this much visibility, could accelerate my career in ways that normal progression through the ranks never would. The FBI, like most large organizations, had traditional pathways to advancement that typically took decades to navigate. But exceptional performance in high-profile cases could create exceptions to those traditional timelines. I appreciate you thinking about the long-term implications, I said. To be honest, I've been so focused on making sure we execute successfully that I haven't spent much time considering what comes after. That's what makes you good at this job, Sarah replied. You focus on the mission instead of the politics. But after Friday, the politics are going to find you, whether you're looking for them or not. Just be ready for that. After Sarah left, I spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing operational details and double-checking contingency plans, but part of my mind kept returning to her words. She was right that this level of visibility would change things, create opportunities and expectations that hadn't existed before. The question was whether I was ready for that kind of change, and whether I wanted the career trajectory that would likely result from it. That evening, I drove home through downtown Washington traffic, watching the familiar landmarks slide past my car windows, and thinking about how different my life might look in just a few days. The monuments and government buildings that had become routine parts of my daily commute suddenly felt more significant, more connected to the work I was doing and the role I was playing in something larger than myself. My apartment, when I finally reached it, felt like a sanctuary from the intensity of the day. I changed into comfortable clothes, opened a bottle of wine, and settled onto my couch with a stack of case files that needed final review before Thursday morning. But as I worked through the documents, my mind kept drifting to the conversation I would eventually have to have with my family. The media attention that Sarah had warned me about would make it impossible to keep my professional achievements separate from my personal relationships. When the FBI director announced the success of Operation Digital Fortress, when my name appeared in newspaper articles and television reports, when my photograph appeared alongside stories about the investigation's success, my family would finally understand what I had been working on all these months, when they thought I was just pushing papers around a government office. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same people who had criticized my career choices would probably want to take credit for my success once it became public. The parents who had found my government job so embarrassing would suddenly discover that having a daughter in federal law enforcement was something to be proud of, especially when that daughter was receiving recognition at the highest levels. But I wasn't sure I wanted their pride, at least not on those terms. Pride that was contingent on external validation, on public recognition, on achievements that met their definition of success rather than my own, felt hollow compared to the satisfaction I had found in the work itself. The approval I had craved for so many years suddenly seemed less important than the respect I had earned from colleagues who understood the value of what we were doing. My secure phone rang again around 9 o'clock, interrupting my review of the final arrest warrants. This time it was Agent Thompson, calling from the field office in Chicago, where he was coordinating the Midwest component of Thursday's operation. Rodriguez, I wanted to give you a heads up about something that's developing out here. One of our targets, the guy we've identified as the network's primary money laundering coordinator, has been making some unusual moves in the last 24 hours. Our surveillance team thinks he might be preparing to run. This was the kind of development that could complicate everything if not handled properly. Flight risk was always a concern in major investigations, especially when dealing with criminals who had significant financial resources and international connections. If key targets disappeared before we could execute the arrest warrants, it could undermine the entire operation. What kind of unusual moves? I asked, already pulling up the Chicago target files on my laptop. He's been liquidating cryptocurrency positions, converting digital assets to cash through multiple exchanges. Our financial analysis team thinks he's moved about $2 million in the last 48 hours, all into accounts that are easier to access quickly. $2 million was enough to disappear very effectively, especially for someone with the technical sophistication to cover his digital tracks. If this target was preparing to flee, we needed to adjust our timeline or risk losing a key component of the network before we could complete the takedown. Have you discussed this with Assistant Director Williams? I asked, running through contingency options in my head. She's my next call. But I wanted to talk to you first, since you're the task force commander. This could affect the coordination with our international partners, if we have to move faster than planned. Agent Thompson was right to be concerned about the international coordination aspect. The European arrests were scheduled to happen simultaneously with our domestic operation, based on careful timing that had taken weeks to negotiate. If we had to accelerate our timeline to prevent targets from fleeing, it could disrupt the coordination that was essential to the overall success of the operation. Let me conference in Williams and we'll discuss options, I said, already dialing the assistant director's secure line. We may need to consider executing the Chicago warrants ahead of schedule, even if it means sacrificing some of the surprise element for the other targets. The next hour was spent in complex tactical discussions, weighing the risks of maintaining the original timeline against the risks of allowing key targets to escape. These were the kinds of decisions that separated successful investigations from ones that fell apart at the crucial moment, and the responsibility for making the right choice ultimately rested with me as the task force commander. We finally decided to maintain the original Thursday morning timeline, but to increase surveillance on the potential flight risks and prepare contingency plans for immediate execution of warrants if any targets showed signs of imminent departure. It was a compromise that balanced the various risks while preserving as much of the operational plan as possible. After the call ended, I sat in the quiet of my apartment, surrounded by case files and legal documents, and allowed myself to fully grasp the weight of the responsibility I was carrying. Dozens of agents across multiple states were depending on the decisions I made. Hundreds of victims were counting on us to successfully dismantle the network that had stolen from them. International law enforcement agencies were coordinating their operations based on plans I had developed. The young woman who had been called an embarrassment at a country club dining table just a few days earlier was now the person responsible for one of the most complex and significant federal law enforcement operations in recent memory. The contrast between those two realities was so stark that it felt almost surreal. I finished reviewing the last of the case files around midnight, double-checking details and contingency plans one final time before trying to get some sleep. Tomorrow would bring the final briefing with Director Morrison, the last round of coordination calls with field offices and international partners, and the final preparations for an operation that would define my career and potentially change my life in ways I was only beginning to understand. As I finally turned off the lights and headed toward my bedroom, I thought about the conversation I had avoided having with my parents since the country club incident. Part of me wanted to call them, to somehow prepare them for what they were about to see and hear. But another part of me, the part that had been hurt by their criticism and dismissal, wanted them to discover my professional reality the same way the rest of the world would, by watching the FBI director announce the success of Operation Digital Fortress on the evening news. Because sometimes the best response to being underestimated isn't explanation or justification. Sometimes it's simply allowing your actions to speak for themselves, letting your achievements provide the context that words never could. My family had made their assessment of my worth and my potential based on assumptions and stereotypes rather than evidence. In less than 48 hours, they would have all the evidence they needed to understand just how wrong they had been. The last thing I remembered before falling asleep was the image of my mother's face when she realized that the daughter she had called an embarrassment was about to receive recognition at the highest levels of American law enforcement. The daughter she thought was wasting her life on an unimportant government job was actually protecting her country in ways that most people never would or could. And the sweetest part of all was that she would have to learn about it the same way everyone else did, by watching the news. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that made Washington feel electric with possibility. I was awake before my alarm, dressed in my best suit, and reviewing final operational details while my coffee brewed. The secure phone had been quiet since midnight, which in the world of federal law enforcement meant that everything was proceeding according to plan across all 6 operational zones. At exactly 6:30 a.m., my phone rang with the confirmation I'd been waiting for. Assistant Director Williams' voice was steady but carrying the undercurrent of controlled excitement that came with executing a major operation. Rodriguez, all teams are in position. European partners confirm readiness. We are green across all operational parameters. Copy that, I replied, feeling the familiar surge of focused energy that came with transitioning from planning to action. Initiating final countdown sequence. The next 4 hours would determine whether 18 months of investigation, planning, and coordination would result in the successful dismantling of one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises in modern history, or whether months of work would be compromised by unforeseen complications and missed opportunities. I arrived at the FBI field office at 7:15, walking through corridors that hummed with the particular energy of a major operation in progress. The Joint Operations Center had been transformed into something resembling mission control, with multiple screens displaying real-time feeds from surveillance teams, communication logs from coordinating agencies, and digital maps showing the locations of targets across 6 states. Agent Chen was already at her station, coordinating the technical aspects of the operation with a precision that came from years of experience in complex digital investigations. She looked up as I entered, giving me a quick thumbs up that indicated all technical systems were functioning normally and all digital surveillance was proceeding as planned. Target Alpha in New York is mobile, heading toward his office building, Agent Martinez reported from his monitoring station. Surveillance confirms normal routine, no indication of flight risk behavior. Target Bravo in Los Angeles is at his residence, showing no signs of unusual activity, came another voice from across the room. Local teams are in position and ready to execute on your command. I took my position at the Central Command Console, surrounded by screens that displayed information from field teams across the country. The weight of command felt different in that moment, more immediate and consequential than it had during the months of investigation and planning. Every decision I made in the next few hours would affect not just the success of the operation, but the safety of the agents executing warrants, and the ultimate fate of the criminals we had been tracking. At exactly 10 a.m. Eastern Time, I gave the command that set everything in motion. All stations, this is command. Execute, execute, execute. The operations center erupted into controlled activity as field teams across 6 states began simultaneous execution of federal arrest warrants. Radio communications crackled with updates from tactical teams, surveillance units, and local law enforcement agencies that were providing support for the coordinated takedown. Target Alpha secured without incident. Suspect in custody, computer equipment secured for evidence processing. Target Bravo resisted but is now in custody. Significant cryptocurrency hardware discovered on premises. Forensics team en route. Chicago primary target attempted to flee through rear exit but was intercepted by tactical team. Suspect in custody, $2 million in cash discovered in vehicle. The reports continued streaming in as the morning progressed, each successful arrest representing months of investigative work finally reaching fruition. By noon Eastern Time, 34 of the 37 primary targets were in custody, with the remaining 3 being actively pursued by tactical teams who had encountered minor complications, but nothing that threatened the overall success of the operation. Assistant Director Williams appeared at my shoulder as the final arrest confirmations came through. Rodriguez, I've never seen coordination like this. 6 states, 14 federal agencies, international partners in 4 countries, and we executed flawlessly. This is going to be studied in law enforcement academies for years. The praise felt good, but I was too focused on ensuring complete success to fully process the compliments. The 3 remaining targets were considered high-priority arrests, and the operation wouldn't be complete until they were all in custody, and their digital infrastructure was fully secured. Status on the Miami target? I asked Agent Thompson, who was coordinating the southeastern component of the operation. Tactical team has the building surrounded, but the suspect barricaded himself in a server room and is attempting to destroy evidence. IT specialists are working to preserve data remotely, but we may lose some digital evidence if he's successful in his destruction efforts. This was the kind of complication that could turn a perfect operation into something less than complete success. Digital evidence was often the most crucial component of cybercrime prosecutions, and losing server data could significantly impact our ability to build strong cases against some of the network's key players. Can we cut power to the building and force him out? I asked, running through tactical options in my head. Negative. The server room has independent power systems, and cutting building power might actually help him destroy evidence faster. IT team thinks they can preserve most of the critical data remotely, but it's going to take time. Time was exactly what we didn't have. Every minute the suspect remained barricaded gave him additional opportunities to destroy evidence that had taken months to identify and catalog. But rushing the tactical resolution could endanger agents and potentially result in the complete loss of digital evidence that was crucial to prosecuting the entire network. Give the IT team another 15 minutes to secure what they can remotely, then we go tactical, I decided. I'd rather have partial evidence and a suspect in custody than risk losing everything. The 15 minutes felt like hours as I monitored communications from the Miami team, while simultaneously tracking the progress of evidence processing at the other arrest locations. Digital forensics teams were working to secure servers, computers, and storage devices that contained the evidence we would need to build prosecutable cases against the entire network. Finally, the update I'd been waiting for came through. Command, Miami target is in custody. Suspect attempted to destroy server data, but IT team was able to preserve approximately 80% of critical evidence. Sufficient data secured to proceed with prosecution. Outstanding work, all teams, I announced over the Operations Center communications system. Operation Digital Fortress is complete. All primary targets are in custody. Digital infrastructure secured, evidence preservation proceeding, according to plan. The Operations Center erupted in cheers and applause as agents and technical specialists celebrated the successful completion of one of the most complex federal law enforcement operations in recent memory. But even as I accepted congratulations and participated in the celebration, part of my mind was already moving forward to the next phase, the media announcement that would make this operation public knowledge. Director Morrison appeared in the Operations Center shortly after the final arrest confirmations, accompanied by senior officials from the Department of Justice, who had been monitoring the operation from FBI headquarters. His presence in our field office was unusual and indicated just how significant this case was being viewed at the highest levels of federal law enforcement. Agent Rodriguez, he said, extending his hand in congratulation. Exceptional work. This operation will be remembered as a landmark achievement in cybercrime enforcement. The coordination, the technical innovation, the international cooperation, all of it was flawlessly executed under your leadership. The recognition from the director himself was both professionally gratifying and personally overwhelming. This was the kind of moment that agents spend entire careers hoping to experience, and I was having difficulty processing the fact that it was actually happening to me. Thank you, Director. The success belongs to the entire task force and all the supporting agencies. I was just fortunate to be part of an exceptional team. Agent Rodriguez, humility is an admirable quality, but don't minimize your contribution to this achievement. The Attorney General specifically asked me to convey his personal congratulations, and he's looking forward to meeting you at tomorrow's press conference. The Attorney General. The press conference. Suddenly, the reality of the media attention that would follow this operation hit me with full force. Tomorrow morning, I would be standing in front of cameras and reporters, representing not just the FBI but the entire federal law enforcement community, explaining to the American public how we had dismantled a criminal enterprise that had stolen hundreds of millions of dollars from innocent victims. Director, if I may ask, what level of media attention are we expecting for tomorrow's announcement? Director Morrison smiled in a way that suggested the answer was going to be larger than I had anticipated. Agent Rodriguez, this is going to be the lead story on every major news network. The Justice Department's press office has been fielding calls from national and international media outlets since word began circulating about a major cybercrime announcement. This is going to be significant coverage. Significant coverage. National news networks. International media attention. The same parents who had called me an embarrassment less than a week earlier were about to see their daughter become the public face of one of the most important federal law enforcement operations in recent memory. The afternoon was consumed with debriefings, evidence processing coordination, and preparation for the legal proceedings that would follow the arrests. Federal prosecutors were already reviewing the evidence packages that digital forensics teams had prepared, building the cases that would eventually send the criminal network's leadership to prison for decades. Agent Chen found me in my office around 4 o'clock, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the satisfied expression that came with successfully completing a complex technical operation. Maya, I wanted to thank you for trusting me with the technical coordination role. This was the most challenging and rewarding case I've ever worked on. Sarah, you made this operation possible. The technical innovation, the digital forensics, the evidence preservation, none of it would have worked without your expertise. She sat down across from my desk and was quiet for a moment before speaking again. Can I ask you something personal? How are you feeling about the media attention that's coming tomorrow? I know this wasn't something you were necessarily seeking when you took the task force command role. It was a thoughtful question, and one I'd been wrestling with myself since Director Morrison's comments about the scale of coverage we could expect. Honestly, I'm not sure. The work has always been the reward for me. The satisfaction of solving complex problems and catching criminals who thought they were too smart to get caught. The public recognition feels almost secondary to that. But it's going to change things for you, whether you want it to or not. This kind of visibility, at your age, with this level of success, it's going to create opportunities and expectations that didn't exist before. Sarah was right, of course. Success at this level, with this much media attention, would fundamentally alter my career trajectory, and probably my personal life as well. The agent, who had been criticized by her family for choosing an unimportant government job, was about to become a nationally recognized figure in federal law enforcement. I suppose I'll deal with those changes as they come, I said. Right now, I'm just focused on making sure tomorrow's announcement properly recognizes the work of everyone who made this operation successful. After Sarah left, I spent the remainder of the afternoon reviewing the press materials that the FBI's Public Affairs Office had prepared for tomorrow's announcement. The press release was comprehensive, detailing the scope of the investigation, the international cooperation that had made it possible, the sophisticated techniques that had been used to track digital evidence, and the significance of the arrests in terms of protecting American citizens from cybercrime. What struck me most was seeing my own name prominently featured in materials that would be distributed to media outlets around the world. Agent Maya Rodriguez, task force commander, appeared repeatedly throughout the documents, along with quotes from senior officials praising the leadership and innovation that had made the operation successful. My parents, who had questioned whether my government job was really a career, were about to learn that their daughter had been leading one of the most significant federal law enforcement operations in recent memory. The same people who had worried that I was too focused on work to build a meaningful life were about to discover that the work I'd been focused on involved protecting hundreds of thousands of American citizens from sophisticated criminals. The irony was almost overwhelming. While they had been criticizing my career choices and questioning my priorities, I had been building a professional reputation that would eventually earn recognition at the highest levels of federal law enforcement. While they worried about my failure to conform to their expectations for traditional success, I had been achieving the kind of professional success that most law enforcement officers never experience. That evening, I drove home through Washington traffic with a different perspective on the familiar landmarks and government buildings. The Capitol Dome, the Washington Monument, The various federal office buildings that housed the agencies and departments that kept the country functioning, all felt more personally significant now that I had played a meaningful role in one of their major achievements. My apartment, when I finally reached it, felt like a sanctuary where I could process the day's events without the pressure of maintaining professional composure. I changed into comfortable clothes, opened a bottle of wine, and settled onto my couch with the realization that this was probably the last quiet evening I would have for a while. Tomorrow's press conference would make me a public figure, at least within the law enforcement community and probably beyond. The privacy and anonymity that had allowed me to focus entirely on the work itself would be replaced by visibility and recognition that would create new opportunities and new pressures. My phone rang around 8 o'clock, and I was surprised to see my sister Isabel's name on the caller ID. We spoke regularly but not frequently, and her calling on a Thursday evening was unusual enough to make me curious about what had prompted it. "Maya, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important, but I wanted to call and apologize for what happened at the country club last Sunday. Mom and Dad were completely out of line, and I should have said something. The apology was unexpected, but appreciated." Isabel had always been the family peacemaker, the daughter who managed to maintain relationships with everyone, while avoiding the conflicts that seemed to follow me everywhere. "I appreciate that, Isabel. It was a difficult afternoon, but I survived it." "I know you did, but that doesn't make it okay. They don't understand your work, and instead of trying to learn about it, they just dismiss it as unimportant. That's not fair to you, and it's not fair to the work you're doing." Isabel's words carried more weight because she wasn't someone who typically criticized our parents or took sides in family conflicts. If she was calling to apologize for their behavior, it meant that the country club incident had been even more inappropriate than I had realized. "Has anyone said anything to them about how they treated me?" I asked, curious about whether there had been family discussions about the incident. "Cousin Maria called me the next day and said she was embarrassed by how they talked to you. Aunt Carmen actually called Mom and told her she thought they were too harsh. Even Uncle Miguel said something about how they should be proud of having a daughter in federal law enforcement instead of criticizing you for not being married." This was news to me. I had assumed that the family consensus supported my parents' perspective, that everyone agreed I was somehow failing at life because I hadn't followed the traditional path they expected. Learning that some family members had actually defended me was both surprising and gratifying. "I had no idea anyone said anything," I said. "Mom and Dad don't like being criticized, so they didn't mention it. But there's definitely been some family discussion about whether they were unfair to you." We talked for another few minutes about family dynamics and the pressures that came with trying to maintain relationships with people who had fundamentally different values and expectations. Isabel was sympathetic and supportive in a way that reminded me why I valued my relationship with her, despite the complications that came with family loyalty. After we hung up, I found myself thinking about how different tomorrow's conversation with my parents would be. Instead of defending my career choices, or trying to explain why their vision for my future didn't align with my own goals, I would be calling to let them know that their daughter was about to appear on national television, standing next to the FBI director as he announced one of the most successful federal law enforcement operations in recent memory. The transformation from embarrassment to achievement would be complete, but not because I had changed to meet their expectations. Instead, they would finally understand what I had been working toward all along, and they would realize that their assessment of my choices had been based on ignorance rather than insight. I spent the rest of the evening reviewing my notes for tomorrow's press conference, practicing answers to questions that reporters might ask, and trying to prepare myself for the level of attention that Director Morrison had indicated we could expect. The technical aspects of the investigation were complex enough that explaining them to a general audience would require careful preparation and clear communication. But beyond the professional preparation, I was also trying to mentally prepare for the personal implications of becoming a public figure. The agent who had worked in relative anonymity for her entire career was about to become associated with a major national news story, and that visibility would create both opportunities and complications that I had never experienced before. As I finally prepared for bed, I thought about the phone call I would make to my parents tomorrow evening, after the press conference had aired on the national news. The same parents who had called me an embarrassment would have spent the day fielding calls from friends and relatives who had seen their daughter on television, receiving recognition at the highest levels of American law enforcement. The conversation wouldn't be about apologies or explanations or attempts to justify my career choices. It would be about facts that they couldn't dismiss or minimize, achievements that spoke for themselves, and recognition that had been earned through excellence rather than compromise. And for the first time since that afternoon at the country club, I was looking forward to talking to them about my work. Because tomorrow, they would finally understand what I had been doing all those evenings when I was too busy to attend family dinners, all those weekends when I was working instead of socializing, all those years when I was building something meaningful instead of settling for something traditional. The last thing I remembered before falling asleep was imagining the look on my mother's face when she realized that the daughter she had called an embarrassment was about to become one of the most recognized federal agents in the country. The daughter she thought was wasting her life on unimportant work had actually been protecting the financial security of hundreds of thousands of American families. Tomorrow would bring vindication, but more importantly, it would bring the satisfaction of knowing that I had stayed true to my own vision of success, despite pressure to conform to someone else's expectations. The work had been its own reward, but the recognition would finally allow my family to understand why that work had been worth pursuing. Friday morning dawned with an unseasonable warmth that made the October air feel charged with anticipation. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror at 5:30 a.m., adjusting the navy blue suit I had chosen for what would undoubtedly be the most significant press conference of my career. The reflection staring back at me looked composed and professional, but underneath that carefully maintained exterior, I could feel the weight of everything that was about to change. My secure phone had been silent since midnight, which meant that all 37 suspects were still in custody, evidence processing was proceeding smoothly, and there were no complications that would require last-minute adjustments to our media strategy. In the world of federal law enforcement, silence often represented the highest form of success. The drive to FBI headquarters took me through the heart of Washington, past the monuments and government buildings that had become routine parts of my daily landscape. But this morning felt different, charged with the knowledge that by evening, my name would be associated with one of the most significant federal law enforcement achievements in recent memory. I arrived at headquarters an hour before the scheduled press conference, walking through corridors that buzzed with the particular energy that surrounded major media events. The press briefing room was being prepared by technicians who were setting up cameras, adjusting lighting, and testing audio equipment for the national media outlets that would broadcast our announcement to millions of viewers. Assistant Director Williams met me in the green room, carrying a steaming cup of coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who had successfully orchestrated a complex operation from start to finish. "Rodriguez, are you ready for this? The media turnout is even larger than we anticipated." CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, all three major networks, plus international outlets from 6 countries. International coverage. The scope of media attention was expanding beyond anything I had imagined when I first accepted the task force commander role 18 months earlier. The investigation that had started with a single suspicious transaction flagged by a bank's fraud detection system was about to become a global news story about American law enforcement's ability to combat sophisticated cybercrime. "Any last-minute changes to the presentation format?" I asked, reviewing the speaking notes I had prepared for the technical briefing portion of the press conference. "Director Morrison wants you to handle the technical explanation portion yourself. He believes that having the task force commander explain the methodology directly will give the announcement more credibility and impact." This meant that I would be speaking directly to a national television audience, explaining complex digital forensics techniques to reporters and viewers who had limited technical backgrounds. The challenge would be making the investigation's innovations accessible without oversimplifying the genuine sophistication of the work we had accomplished. Director Morrison appeared in the green room at exactly 9:15, accompanied by Deputy Attorney General Patricia Hayes, whose presence indicated that the Department of Justice was treating this announcement as a significant policy achievement. The involvement of senior DOJ officials meant that Operation Digital Fortress was being positioned as evidence of the federal government's commitment to combating cybercrime at the highest levels. "Agent Rodriguez," Director Morrison said, extending his hand in greeting, I want you to know that your work on this investigation has been exceptional. The Attorney General specifically asked me to convey his personal appreciation for your leadership and innovation. The recognition from the highest levels of federal law enforcement was both professionally gratifying and personally overwhelming. This was the kind of acknowledgement that agents spend entire careers working toward, and I was still processing the reality that it was happening to me at 28 years old. Thank you, Director. I'm honored to represent the entire task force and all the supporting agencies that made this operation successful. Deputy Attorney General Hayes stepped forward with a warm smile that suggested genuine respect, rather than perfunctory acknowledgement. Agent Rodriguez, I've been briefed on your role in developing the cryptocurrency tracking methodology that was crucial to this investigation's success. That kind of innovation is exactly what we need to stay ahead of increasingly sophisticated criminals. The cryptocurrency tracking techniques had indeed been central to our ability to follow the money through multiple blockchain networks and international exchanges. Traditional financial investigation methods were often inadequate when dealing with criminals who understood how to exploit digital currency's perceived anonymity, but our team had developed approaches that turned their technological sophistication against them. At exactly 10 a.m., we walked from the green room toward the press briefing podium, where dozens of cameras and reporters were waiting to hear about Operation Digital Fortress. The briefing room was packed beyond capacity, with additional media representatives standing along the walls and in the back of the room. Director Morrison approached the podium first, his commanding presence immediately focusing the room's attention. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us this morning. I am here to announce the successful completion of Operation Digital Fortress, the largest coordinated cybercrime enforcement action in FBI history. He spoke for several minutes about the investigation's scope, the international coordination that had made simultaneous arrests possible, and the significance of dismantling a criminal network that had stolen over $200 million from American citizens. His presentation was polished and authoritative, exactly what the media and public expected from the FBI director during major announcements. Then he did something that took me completely by surprise. The success of this operation was made possible by exceptional leadership and innovation at every level. I want to specifically recognize Agent Maya Rodriguez, who served as task force commander, and whose technical expertise and strategic vision were instrumental in bringing these criminals to justice. The cameras turned toward me as he continued speaking, and I felt the weight of national attention in a way I had never experienced before. Agent Rodriguez developed new methodologies for tracking cryptocurrency transactions that allowed us to follow money through networks that criminals believed were untraceable. Her leadership of this investigation represents the highest standards of federal law enforcement. When Director Morrison finished his opening remarks and introduced me to provide the technical briefing, I stepped to the podium with a mixture of professional confidence and personal nervousness. This was the moment when I would explain to a national audience exactly how we had dismantled one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises in modern history. Thank you, Director Morrison. Operation Digital Fortress succeeded because we developed new approaches to old problems. The criminals we investigated believed that cryptocurrency transactions were anonymous and untraceable, but they underestimated law enforcement's ability to adapt and innovate. I spent the next 15 minutes explaining complex technical concepts in language that general audiences could understand, describing how we had identified patterns in blockchain transactions, traced digital assets through multiple exchanges, and connected anonymous cryptocurrency wallets to real-world identities. The reporters' questions demonstrated genuine interest in understanding the investigation's technical innovations. Agent Rodriguez, can you explain how this methodology might be applied to other cybercrime investigations? Asked a reporter from the Washington Post. The techniques we developed for Operation Digital Fortress have broad applications across all types of financial cybercrime. Criminal enterprises increasingly rely on digital currencies because they believe these transactions can't be traced. But our work demonstrates that digital evidence often provides more comprehensive trails than traditional financial records. Will these techniques be shared with international law enforcement agencies? Asked another reporter. We're already working with our international partners to provide training and technical assistance. Cybercrime is a global problem that requires coordinated responses, and sharing investigative innovations is essential to staying ahead of criminal innovation. The questions continued for another 20 minutes, covering everything from the specific charges being filed against the arrested suspects to the broader implications for federal cybercrime enforcement policy. Throughout the questioning, I found myself speaking with confidence and authority about work that had consumed my life for the past 18 months. As the press conference concluded and the cameras stopped rolling, I felt a strange mixture of relief and anticipation. The public announcement was complete, but the personal implications were just beginning. By evening, this press conference would be broadcast on national news programs, and my name would be associated with one of the most significant federal law enforcement achievements in recent memory. Deputy Attorney General Hayes approached me as the media representatives began filing out of the briefing room. Agent Rodriguez, exceptional presentation. You made complex technical concepts accessible without oversimplifying the genuine sophistication of your work. That's a rare skill, and one that will serve you well as your career progresses. The comment about career progression reminded me that success at this level, with this much visibility, would inevitably create opportunities and expectations that hadn't existed before. The agent who had been criticized by her family for choosing an unimportant government job was about to discover how public recognition could transform professional trajectories. Agent Chen found me in my office an hour after the press conference, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who had successfully completed a career-defining project. Maya, I just wanted to say that watching you handle that press conference was inspiring. You represented all of us perfectly. Thank you, Sarah. I couldn't have done any of this without your technical expertise and the dedication of the entire team. She sat down across from my desk and was quiet for a moment before speaking again. Have you thought about what comes next? This level of recognition, at your age, it's going to open doors that most agents never see. The question of what came next was one I had been avoiding, but it was becoming impossible to ignore. Success at this level typically led to offers of advancement, transfers to headquarters positions, opportunities to work on increasingly high-profile cases and policy initiatives. Honestly, I've been so focused on completing this investigation that I haven't spent much time thinking about the long-term implications, I said. I suppose I'll have to start considering options that didn't exist before. Whatever you decide, you've earned the right to choose your own path. That's the real value of achievement at this level. The ability to shape your own career rather than having it shaped by organizational hierarchies and traditional advancement timelines. After Sarah left, I spent the afternoon handling the administrative details that followed major operations, coordinating with prosecutors who were preparing cases against the arrested suspects, and beginning the process of documenting lessons learned for future cybercrime investigations. But throughout the afternoon, part of my mind kept returning to the personal implications of the morning's press conference. The same parents who had called me an embarrassment less than a week earlier were about to see their daughter on the evening news, standing next to the FBI director as he praised her leadership and innovation. My phone began ringing around 3 o'clock with congratulatory calls from colleagues, former classmates, and law enforcement contacts who had seen news coverage of the press conference. The volume of positive feedback was overwhelming and gratifying, but it also drove home the reality that my professional life had fundamentally changed in ways I was still processing. Around 4 o'clock, I received a call that I had been both expecting and dreading. My sister Isabel's name appeared on my caller ID, and I knew she was calling because she had seen the press conference coverage and wanted to discuss the family implications before I spoke with our parents. Maya, oh my God, I just saw you on CNN. I had no idea you were working on something this significant. Why didn't you tell me? Isabel's voice carried a mixture of pride, amazement, and perhaps a touch of hurt that I hadn't shared the magnitude of what I was working on. But federal investigations required operational security that made it impossible to discuss details with family members, even ones who could be trusted with sensitive information. I couldn't talk about it while the investigation was active. Federal operations require complete confidentiality until cases are made public. Maya, this is incredible. The FBI director was praising your work on national television. Do you understand how amazing this is? I'm still processing it myself, I said honestly. It's been a long 18 months, and I'm just glad we were able to successfully complete the operation. Isabel was quiet for a moment before asking the question I knew was coming. Have you talked to Mom and Dad? Because they're going to have to deal with the fact that they called you an embarrassment less than a week ago, and now you're being recognized as one of the most successful federal agents in the country. I haven't called them yet. I wanted to let them process the news coverage first, then have a conversation about what this means for our family relationships going forward. Maya, this changes everything. Not just for your career, but for how the family understands who you are and what you've accomplished. They're going to have to acknowledge that they were completely wrong about your choices. Isabel was right, of course. The press conference had created a situation where my parents could no longer dismiss my career as unimportant, or criticize my priorities as misguided. The work they had characterized as meaningless paper pushing had actually involved protecting hundreds of thousands of American citizens from sophisticated criminals. I hope this leads to better family relationships, I said. But I'm not going to pretend that their approval suddenly matters more because it comes with public recognition. You don't have to pretend anything. You've proven that you were right to follow your own path, even when everyone else questioned your choices. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet of my office, surrounded by case files and commendation letters, and reflected on how much my life had changed in the span of a single week. The agent who had been called an embarrassment at a country club dining table was now being celebrated on national television for leading one of the most significant federal law enforcement operations in recent memory. The transformation felt surreal, but it also felt like vindication for years of staying true to my own vision of success, despite pressure to conform to other people's expectations. The work had always been its own reward, but the public recognition would finally allow my family to understand why that work had been worth pursuing. As evening approached, I prepared for the phone call that would close this chapter of family misunderstanding and open a new one based on facts rather than assumptions. The call came at 7:30 that evening, just as the national news was wrapping up their extended coverage of Operation Digital Fortress. My mother's voice was different than I had ever heard it before, subdued and almost hesitant, in a way that was completely foreign to her usual commanding tone. Maya, we just saw the news. Your father and I had no idea that you were working on something so important. The FBI director, he said such wonderful things about your work. I could hear my father in the background, his voice carrying the same uncharacteristic uncertainty. They had spent the day fielding calls from relatives, neighbors, and friends who had seen their daughter on television, receiving recognition at the highest levels of American law enforcement. Yes, it's been a significant case, I said simply, not rushing to fill the awkward silence that followed. Maya, we owe you an apology. What we said at the country club, the way we talked about your career, we didn't understand what you were doing. We thought your job was just paperwork and computers, but you were protecting people, catching criminals who stole millions of dollars. The apology was genuine, but it came 18 months too late, and only after public recognition had forced them to confront their misconceptions. Still, it represented acknowledgement of something I had waited years to hear. I appreciate that, Mom. But I need you to understand that the work was always important, whether or not you recognized it. My job was never about impressing anyone or meeting your expectations for what my life should look like. My father took the phone then, his voice carrying a weight I had never heard before. Meja, we're proud of you. We should have been proud all along, but we didn't understand. Your Uncle Miguel called 3 times today to tell us how wrong we were about your career. Even Aunt Carmen said she always knew you were special. The family members who had participated in criticizing my choices were now calling to distance themselves from those opinions, rewriting history to position themselves as supporters who had always believed in my potential. It was predictable, but also hollow in its transparent opportunism. Dad, I'm glad you're proud now, but I hope you understand that I can't base my self-worth on recognition that only comes when achievements become public. I need to know that you respect my choices even when you don't understand them. 3 weeks later, I received the call that would define the next phase of my career. Director Morrison's office wanted to discuss new opportunities that had emerged following the success of Operation Digital Fortress. The visibility and recognition had indeed opened doors that hadn't existed before, creating possibilities for advancement and influence that could shape federal cybercrime policy for years to come. But as I sat in my apartment that evening, looking at the commendation letters and news clippings that documented my professional achievements, I realized that the most important transformation hadn't been in my career trajectory or public recognition. It had been in my understanding that seeking approval from people who didn't respect my choices was a waste of energy that could be better invested in work that actually mattered. My parents had finally learned to be proud of me, but I had learned something more valuable. I didn't need their pride to validate my worth or my choices. The work spoke for itself, the achievements stood on their own merit, and the respect of colleagues who understood the value of what I was doing mattered more than the approval of people who only valued success when it came with external recognition. The country club embarrassment had become national television recognition, but the real victory was internal, the knowledge that I had stayed true to my own vision of meaningful work despite pressure to conform to someone else's definition of success. Agent in charge, ready for whatever came next. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.